All right, thank you for that introduction. I'm really just going to start with this image that to me summarizes both the key question and also a big gap in our knowledge. It tells us what ecologists have been sort of like ringing the alarm and been raising these red flags that species are in free fall. Biodiversity losses are increasing, extinction rates are maybe 100, 1,000 times higher than what they think are kind of like the background normal levels that they should be at. But that raises a question for us, I think, as social scientists and economists, of exactly what are the impacts on human well-being from all of these biodiversity losses, and how can we even try to answer that question, given all of the constraints that we have on running, just experiments with manipulating ecosystems at a large scale. So and broadly speaking, we can really think about just like research in economics, having a lot of theoretical work that's trying to understand the way that a firm or humans make the decisions, how like economic agents make decisions, or just like advancing the statistical methods that we use to answer those questions. We can think about like estimating very structural models that have a parameter in which we're like interested to quantify that parameter. But today we're going to focus on trying to understand what are kind of like the tools we use to estimate treatment effects that we can have a causal interpretation, meaning that like if event X happens, what's going to be the causal interpretation or causal effect it has on Y, and how even in the absence of very controlled experiments, even with using what we call quasi-experimental settings and tools, we can still recover those answers and how those tools apply to things like answering questions on biodiversity losses. It's really hard to learn about these effects and the causal way because the world only provides us with just like one version of the world. We get to see the factual, we get to see what happened. And there've been these kind of like, abundance of sci-fi work across multiple years. I don't know if anyone recognizes any of the references here on the slide, but each one of them is about like worlds of like what would have happened, what if the world have gone in one direction instead of another. And that's the key fundamental challenge of causal inference. We get to see what actually happened in order to make a statement about the causal effect of any policy or any intervention. We need to know what would have happened in the absence, without that event happening. This is a lot of text. I think we can just skip that, just to kind of like highlight the importance of these methods and of these techniques. Essentially, they revolutionized not just how we do work in economics, but how we do, I think, causal inference work throughout the social sciences, and really revolutionized how we do empirical work, which what led to the Nobel Committee in 2021 awarding it to 3 professors that have really pushed the envelope and completely revolutionized the skills and the tools we have in our toolbox on how to do this kind of work. And now I'll introduce just a little bit of notation. There's gonna be some math, there's gonna be some symbols, but there's really just like addition and subtraction, okay? All we need to think about is some structure that we need to place on the world. And that structure tells us some like assumptions that as long as those assumptions are valid and sensible, we can maybe recover something that has that kind of like causal interpretation. We're going to keep things very simple. We're going to have 2 groups, A and B, 2 periods, 1 and 2. In period 1, both of the groups are not experiencing a certain condition. Okay, they're not receiving the treatment, they're not experiencing the policy, they're not experiencing the shock. In the second period, there are going to experience it, and like only group A is going to experience it, group B is not going to experience it. We're going to focus on learning about the changes in group A in between those time periods relative to the changes in group B. Why is that helpful? If you're willing to accept that this somewhat caricature characterization of the world makes sense, the outcome for group A or B in time period 1 or 2 is some function of a group effect, okay, that stays constant over time. This is something that is true of group A or is true of group B. This is something that is true of period 1 or is true of period 2. This is only going to be relevant for each group. This is going to be relevant for both groups, okay? And in addition, there's going to be this additional parameter D, which is the shock, the treatment, the effect that we're trying to learn about, which some groups will get at a certain time period. In our case, group A is going to get it in the second time period. And there's going to be this parameter beta that's going to tell us something in this equation about what happens when this thing turns on from 0 to 1. How will the fact that like the effect or the treatment or the shock happening affects the outcome? If we think of the two periods and the groups and whether this variable D is equal to 0 or 1, we can write out the very specific equation for each group in each time period. You'll see that there's a lot of similarities here. Each one is getting the respective group parameter. Each one is getting the relevant time period effect. And only group A in period 2 is also getting beta, the effect of this treatment, of this shock, which only turns on in the second period and only turns on for the group A. There's a lot of different symbols here. Most of them we can think about as kind of like nuisance, okay? Like they're not what we're interested in. They're standing in our way of learning about the parameter that we actually care about, beta. How can we still recover beta? How can we still figure out what is the parameter that we're like focused about? And this is truly the day-to-day of applied microeconomists, is coming up with settings and ways that makes sense to imagine that the structure we just talked about for a minute or two is a sensible structure to think about. What turns out to be really nice is if we start just like subtracting one equation from the other, we can start canceling a lot of those different nuisance parameters. So if we take the difference within the first group, okay, just within the group A, the group specific parameter is going to cancel out. Okay, because it's not changing over time. We get to measure it in 2 time periods. We're done with getting one parameter out of the way. We have the parameter we're interested in, and we have this change from period 2 to period 1. The nice thing about, though, is that we have another group where its group-specific parameter is also changing. Sorry, it's also not changing, so it cancels out. So we're only left with these changes between the time periods. So now if we subtract what's happening in group B over time for what's happening in group A over time, we recover our parameter of interest. We recover the effect of the shock, the effect of the treatment. Obviously, on the slide, this works beautifully because we really simplify things, but in reality, there are going to be a lot of other things that at best we can think about this as an approximation. So we don't really think that we're going to be able to recover the exact parameter of interest using this method, but we can at least get an estimate that maybe approximates something close to this beta of interest. And what I'm going to do in kind of like in the next few minutes is just show you a few examples where we can apply this kind of like logic and thinking and with real data examples, talking about examples in ecology, starting with bats. So we think that we know, but what ecologists have told us, that bats, when they eat insects, they are able to provide biological pest control for farmers. And if that's true, then farmers can potentially use fewer pesticides, especially fewer insecticides. And that might be good because from toxicology and epidemiology, we tend to think that these pesticides that are toxic by design are going to potentially have an impact on health externalities. So if we have fewer bats, we might see compensation of farmers using more pesticides, and that's going to result in negative impacts on human health, seeing these externalities increase. The problem is that this is not something that we can easily go and learn about, because we're not going to be just, this is bordering on like mad science. We're not going to go and kill bats at random to just see what happens to pesticide use and health externalities. And universities have what's called an institutional review board that has to like sign off that the research that you're doing is ethical. Okay, I have never tested our institutional review board to see if they'll be okay with me just like manipulating ecosystems at a large scale, and because it's an interesting research question. But we can still rely on nature providing us with settings that are good approximations for that type of an ideal experiment. And when nature does something that's like, oh, this is a great setting to answer a question that we're unable to answer with a full controlled experiment, we'll call that a natural experiment. Okay, because nature has provided us with sort of like an experimental design. In the case that I'm going to talk to you about, involves this invasive fungus species and leading to a syndrome or a disease called white nose syndrome. As you can see from these flakes here on the nose of the bat, that's where the name comes from. These white flakes are essentially the fungus growing on the skin of the bat, and it causes severe damage to the ring membranes, and more severely, it wakes them up during hibernation. Now, for a bat to wake up when they're supposed to be hibernating is practically a death sentence. They wake up, it's cold, they need more food to stay alive, and there's no food to be found because all the insects are gone. And most of them will simply not survive until the end of winter if they wake up during hibernation. Unfortunately, and I should say some of these slides have been updated since, but this is good enough just to convey the point. What we get in this setting that's useful in terms of estimating this is that we had the initial detection in 2006 in New York. And since that, we've found the fungus spreading to new counties over time. So every year, we have more units in the data that we can observe becoming treated or becoming exposed to the shock that we're interested in learning about. Essentially, over time, we're getting something that's pretty close to going around killing bats at random, only we're not doing that. This weird, unfortunate incident of the invasive fungus species showing up is causing that. Just to give you a sense of how quickly a bat population can collapse, this is a corner in a cave with a somewhat healthy bat population. A year after, it dwindled to a shadow of its former self, and a year after, they couldn't find bats anymore in that cave. Okay, this is what an average death rate of 73%, which is ranging between 50 to 99%. There have been complete collapses of populations as a result of this disease. What I did in one of my papers was documenting that just like ecologists predicted and claim that farmers are benefiting from the bats being around, in the years after bats collapsed relative to this detection of the syndrome, farmers in those affected places start to increase their use of insecticides relative to places in which the fungus has not arrived yet. We also see that in the years before the detection of white nose syndrome in the county, there is not a difference on average between the places that are about to experience the collapse of bats and places that will not experience the collapse. So essentially, we have this nice comparison, just like our group A and group B. They're very similar on average in the years before the bat populations collapse, but after bat populations collapse, we're starting to see that the places that experience the collapse diverge and start increasing their insecticide use. This is a problem because we're also seeing this increase in infant mortality rates in the places that are now using more insecticides, which is, again, not all that surprising given how insecticides are toxic compounds by design, and we know that pollution is bad for human health. But this is one of the kind of like the first times that we were able to observe evidence that has a causal interpretation, not just like a simple correlation between mortality and pesticide use. Okay, I'll quickly show you also something about vultures and their collapse in India. I mentioned at the beginning that we as economists want to learn and understand better how to think about the human well-being impacts of losing biodiversity losses, because that should inform, at least to some degree, how we allocate conservation resources. We don't have an infinite budget to save necessarily all of the species and write open checks to protect each one. So how do we make those decisions? Do we necessarily emphasize and prioritize the species that are the most mega-charismatic one, that are the like warmest and fuzziest and inspire us to write these type of poems? Maybe that could work well if those species are also like important in terms of delivering functions and services that we as humans benefit from. But not every important species in the ecosystem is necessarily charismatic. Okay, vultures are a prime example of a species that don't necessarily evoke warm and fuzzy feelings. You don't want to run and hug them, but they're crucial in terms of what they do in the environment. They can consume a body of a cow in under 40 minutes. They can do that safely because their stomachs are about 100 times more acidic than ours. So they are essentially as if we're spraying bleach on the environment. They're the terminal stop for bacteria and pathogens. They just like disinfect the environment and prevent us from having to deal with those like bacteria and infectious diseases. Farmers in India know this. They rely on vultures to remove dead animals, and India is a country with about 500 million livestock animals. There are a lot of dead animals that need to be removed from the environment, otherwise there will be potential severe health consequences. And just to give you kind of like an image of what this looks like, these are the sort of like landfills in which all of these dead animals get dumped in. You can see this competition between vultures and feral dogs, and how sometimes the bodies of dead animals can find themselves in water bodies, which is problematic for many health concerns. And you can see these repeating pleas from local municipalities saying like, please stop dumping animals out in the open, let's use incinerators. And that just like doesn't happen. So the model that we have in mind is that vultures are in competition with other scavengers like dogs and rats. More scavengers mean there are less dead animals out in the wild, but they're in competition with one another. And if there are more dead animals out in the wild, we're worried about the water pollution and the negative impact that will have on health. And if there are more dogs and rats, we're worried about that because they come in contact with humans, unlike vultures. And dogs and rats, especially dogs, are a prime reservoir of rabies. And India is one of the global epicenters of rabies. So if something happened to vultures and the populations collapsed or declined, there'll be more dogs and rats. There'll potentially be more dead cows and rotting flesh because dogs and rats don't consume bodies down to the bone. And we'll get all of these channels negatively impacting human health. Unfortunately, in the mid-90s, vulture populations of a specific species collapsed. It took about a decade to figure out the reason. The reason was a painkiller that was being used and still used today in humans and is very safe. You might know diclofenac under the brand name of Voltaren or Vivarin, I think. It's perfectly safe. If you have it in the medicine cabinet, don't throw it away. Just don't apply it on vultures. Okay, just don't feed it to vultures if you have it as a pill. It's perfectly fine to use on us, though, very effective. It turns out that if you administer it to cattle, it will be effective for them as well, but when a vulture eats the body of a dead cow or any other livestock animal with residue amounts of diclofenac, they develop kidney failure and die within weeks, okay? And that was enough to decimate a population between 30 to 50 million vultures within just a few years, down to just a few thousand of them. And what we know happened is that the patent expired, or there was a generic approval, and we started seeing this big increase over time in both the entry of new patents for or kind of like new generic versions of the drug, and also an explosion in the price and the availability and sale of diclofenac. Perhaps even more importantly, we started seeing vulture population, the share of their observations relative to other birds observed in different data sets, starting to collapse as well. Again, reaffirming what a lot of anecdotal reports that started in the mid-90s, where scientists were saying, what's going on? Half of the birds in my study site are dead. Is anyone else noticing that? And everyone started saying, yes, we just thought this was something specific to our site. We didn't realize this was happening everywhere. This was documented in real time, and ecologists were very concerned about this, okay? So one quote says that like they're so good at what they do in terms of removing animals from the environment is that nothing will be able to fill that niche. Or this concern about without vultures keeping feral dogs in check, there are dogs on the ground, but the skies are empty. Okay, so these are kind of like these very dire predictions as to what will happen to human health now that vultures are gone. We effectively classify India using both habitat suitability model, but also using previously generated maps on the habitat ranges. We're simply trying to tease apart where are the places in India that had a very high exposure and a very high baseline population of vulture populations, and those that had a small one. And what we see is that, again, in the years after vulture population started to decline and collapse, we're seeing this increase in all-cause death rates of humans relative in the high vulture suitability districts relative to the low vulture suitability districts. And once again, we're not really seeing a difference between those two types of places, high and low baseline vultures, in the years before the collapse. So we're seeing them moving in parallel, and then once vulture populations collapse, okay, once our group A is receiving that shock, we're starting to see all-cause death rates diverge and go up. And we're seeing it more in urban areas than rural areas, because in India, urban areas are just like denser, they're a bit bigger in terms of population, more likely to have those animal landfills. Like an urban area in this setting or in this sample doesn't mean you're like New York, Paris, London, and so on. They're just like larger, denser villages. And okay, I'll go over this next example much faster. And there's a kind of like recognized success story of Vietnam being able to turn back, and this is like in a way a feel-good story of being able to turn back a wave of like using 5 times more pesticides than any other area in around them. The reason was they were trying to kill this crop pest, the brown plant hopper, which was very harmful for rice crops. However, the brown plant hopper was pretty much immune to insecticides during this time because they were using so much. Because they were using so much, they were killing everything on the field. Wasps and beetle and all of the other natural enemies that the brown plant hopper wasn't immune to, okay? So they were killing the enemy of their enemy, which was not great. So what the country did was have this soap opera on the radio documenting how farmers can do so much better, and kind of like providing this narrative and a story about how they can reduce their spraying early in the season and save all those beneficial insects on the field. So when the brown plant hopper arrives, they're not landing in a calm swimming pool instead of an ocean full of sharks. That was kind of like the language they were using. So they wanted farmers to not spray so much and actually be able to increase their productivity and their revenue, and potentially increase their yields and potentially mortality. So let me just show you here descriptively. So this is the Mekong River Delta, what's happening to infant mortality rates around the time of the implementation. And you can see how they're dropping very sharply relative to the Red River Delta in the north of the country, where we're not seeing that big of a drop at the beginning. So something clearly changed in the Mekong River Delta right around the timing that this program was launched, when this policy was put in place to convince farmers to use fewer insecticides. And we actually are seeing pretty sharp reductions in infant mortality in the Mekong Delta relative to the Red River Delta around that time. So this is an example of kind of like using the benefits from biodiversity as a way to substitute for insecticide use and gaining health benefits. All right. Which tells us something about like the implications of the insect apocalypse that we became very worried about in the last few years, showing us that like coordinated efforts are helpful and that not all insects are necessarily evil, okay? Which is something that, like, you know, some of my colleagues are still unconvinced about. And let me show you one final example, and then we can kind of like just like open this for like conversation discussion. What about wolves? So in the US, as well as in a lot of other countries, there was a very coordinated campaign to eradicate the gray wolf because it was seen as a competitor for deer, and well as a pest in terms of decimating livestock populations of farmers. So the campaign was very successful. In just a few years, wolves were eradicated throughout most of their habitats. And what a previous paper by not myself, but like by other co-authors showed, that after they were allowed to recover and recolonize parts of Wisconsin, the share of vehicle collisions with deer dropped. Because once you allow wolves to re-enter, they not only prey on deer and reduce their numbers, they also, activate what's called ecology of fear. Right? Deer love to hang around the edge of the forest, for example, by the side of the road, and then they jump in the road and someone hits them. Wolves love to forage for prey along linear features, rivers, pipelines, and roads. When wolves are back in the environment, deer move away from the edge of the forest to the middle of the forest. They move away from the road, which is the main explanation as to why there's this like really big collapse in the share of deer vehicle collisions. And this is a highly, highly contested issue of whether gray wolves should be listed and protected or not, and what does it mean for wolves to be recovered under the Endangered Species Act here in the United States. Finally, there's a big pushback and opposition from livestock farmers in the United States that are not fans of allowing wolf populations to recover because of how they're concerned about the damages regarding livestock populations. Okay, so in new work that we've been working on with Jennifer Rayner and Dominic Parker, Anish Misiran and I are also looking at yet another example across the St. Lawrence River. So this is in Canada now, all right? We have north of the river and south of the river. What's fascinating about this river is that there are no wolves south of the river. They got eradicated, but north of the river, they are still there, okay? So what we did is we took 20 years of data from Canada on vehicle collisions and just looked at what is the proportion of all animal-related vehicle collisions north and south of the river. Okay, so we can see that as you get close to the river, there's this like just mechanical decline in the share of animal-related collisions, but the important part is this discontinuity. Okay, north of the river where we have wolves, we have about 5% of animal-related collisions, but right north of the river, we have about 10%. Okay, so this is a 5 percentage point drop. It's a massive effect of reducing animal vehicle collisions over this like average period of 20 years. We can also think about things being more in equilibrium. And I think that I'll stop here and let you and just like ask questions. And if you have time, I might show you like yet another example. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves, or I can just read off the chat. Okay, so the chat is where we're going to go with this.
Actually, and Dr. Frank, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really valuable, I think, for people to hear about like the theoretical implications. And when you can't do testings, like you said, we can't just kill off a bunch of bats. Like you have to have an understanding of the theories. And that's an important feature of what folks will be studying here at the Harris School.
Well, we can, we choose not to. Okay,
fair. The first question that came into the chat, Alex McMurdy asked, what was the mechanism causing infant mortality to rise as insect populations declined?
This is, oh, so wait, I guess this is about the bats case. So insect populations actually
It's about the Vietnam one with the Mekong.
Vietnam one?
Yes.
Okay.
No worries, Alex, we're good.
All right, so what was happening is that they were reducing their insecticide use to not kill all of the other beneficial insects. So when they were spraying insecticides without even thinking about how much they were spraying, they were killing lots of different insects like wasps and beetles that were really good at fighting and crowding out and attacking and parasiting the brown plant hopper. Okay, so when you were able to like not kill those beneficial insects and have them around to do the work that the insecticides weren't really effective at doing anymore because the brown plant hopper developed immunity to insecticides, you now were able to use less insecticides, spray less of it, actually have fewer crop infestations of the brown plant hopper because you had other insects doing the work for you. And you gained also this additional benefit of having infant mortality improving during this time because you were spraying fewer applications and less insecticides. Hopefully that was able to clarify
that. Dr. Frank Minhee, and I apologize, I'm mispronouncing your name. Really fantastic question here. I mean, you previously had experience working with the Korean government, the Ministry of Oceans and Fishes, and also a vet. And their job was making regulations related to ocean mammals and fish stock. One of the questions, the main question here, you can read the background of their experience, is what methodology can be presented to persuade stakeholders to adopt these sorts of policies? You know, they said it was so hard to find balance of economics and environments in Korea because economic impact should be calculated before environmental regulations are implemented. What would you have as a takeaway on that?
So I think that broadly speaking, the simplest methods end up being the most convincing because they're the easiest to understand, especially for a more general, less technical audience. So whenever there's like a very nice graphical representation. What people, for example, really love about this type of design that we have on the slide now, that's called the regression discontinuity design, which is different than from a lot of the examples I showed you earlier, is that there's just like a very graphical, like you either see the discontinuity or you don't. Okay, it's either there, just like staring you. This is just raw data. This is like summary statistics at different distance intervals along the border. If you can show stakeholders something that like is very easy to understand, that will do a lot of the convincing for you. problems start to arise once the problem is a bit harder to address with a simple method, and you need to use like fancier, more complicated techniques. Then it becomes more of like an art of telling the story well and explaining kind of like how each building block is contributing to our understanding and interpretation of that. I hope that that was helpful.
Dr. Frank, it also looks, Mahima has a question. It looks like Mahima is actually, if my information is correct, is in New Delhi. Had a question saying related to the vulture case study, which is how are factors like diclofenac identified as potential correlate or driver of vulture deaths, since the two seem so unrelated and many researchers may just miss them?
That's a great question. And that's like the fact that, it doesn't seem obvious that this like painkiller that's safe for people and was around since the 70s is the key cause for this. How did we find this out? And that's a reason why it took a decade to figure it out. During the time as vulture populations were declining and collapsing, there were a lot of different ideas. People thought, oh, maybe there's an invasive species or a wildlife disease. There were even conspiracy theories about like intentional poisoning of vultures by some like other country. And a lot of different ideas went around until this team of researchers started saying that everyone saw that like kidney failure was the key reason, and they started to understand like, okay, this has to be something about what they're digesting. What are they digesting? So they sampled that and they saw there were traces of diclofenac. So they were like, okay, let's make sure that like all of these like traces of diclofenac in dead vultures are found in all of the samples of dead vultures that we found, and they did. And then they also, this is not great, but they just like experimentally fed traces of like meat with traces of the painkiller to vultures and saw that every time that they did, the vulture died within a few weeks. So like the combination of the observational and the experimental study provided me kind of like the smoking gun of like, okay, it's that. In other cases, it took us much longer. It took us a very long time to understand the DDT was that harmful for wildlife, okay? More than, kind of like took 20 years of evidence to finally ban DDT across most of the Western world. It took us recently 25 years each in the case of like figuring out what was damaging to salmon populations in the US, what was hurting bald eagles. And it's always these like weird combinations that are just like so not what you would think is the cause, but like very detailed hard work over a long period of time ends up delivering an answer.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. I want to answer a question that Maya brought up, and then I want to return to something Alex had a good follow-up question for the Vietnam work. But Maya's question was, in the first case of bats and insecticides, what was the process of collecting the data from farmers? Was it collected from larger operations or from a variety of insecticide users?
Great question. I was in the fortunate position that the US Department of Agriculture, in combination with the US Geological Survey, already put together a database on pesticide use at the county level, and they've been doing it for years. Their main concern was about water quality, but in that process, they compiled the data set on just the different use amounts of each pesticide compound and active ingredient. So I didn't need to do a whole lot of collection. My job was just to classify each one of those active ingredients as like as an insecticide or not.
And then to go into a follow-up from Alex, which this is so, it's lovely to read these kinds of questions. I appreciate you asking this, Alex. I think everybody else is gaining from this as well, which is, he was curious about the hypothesis as for why infant mortality, we're back to Vietnam, would change as a result. Were infant deaths caused by parasitic diseases that insects like wasps controlled? Was it rice shortages, or was it the insecticides harming pregnant mothers or infant development?
The latter, the last point. So we have this really broad literature in epidemiology that documents a very wide range of negative impacts from different pesticide exposure. The problem with that literature that it doesn't have any quasi-experimental variation in it, nothing that like approximates, some of you get exposed to insecticides, some of you don't get, and let's see what happens. And we do know that, again, just like many other forms of pollution, like air pollution and water pollution, these tend to have impacts on health. We tend to focus on infant health because infants are very small, so even small changes in the level of exposure that they're getting relative to their small body mass results in a pretty high dose. Okay, so like the concentration that they get exposed to can have very detrimental health impacts, and it's also sort of like we tend to think of infants as like not having yet time to accumulate this like long health outcome history. So they tell us a lot about how the environment is changing for better or for worse. Like they're in a way, they're like the first ones to benefit from improvements to environmental quality, and they're the first one to really suffer and tell us that something bad is happening in terms of environmental quality as well. As any of you that are parents or have like nephews and nieces, you know that infants are highly delicate creatures that need a lot of protection, and like any environmental scarring or negative exposure can easily be highly detrimental. So to just like bottom line, Alex, to your point, it wasn't that the wasps were parasites or something that the insects were doing. It was the ability to really bring down the use of insecticides. Some of them were like insecticides that were being purchased on the black market that were actually banned, or they weren't being used the way they were supposed to be used. And I'm not sure if I emphasized it at the beginning, the Mekong Delta was using 5 times as much insecticides as pretty much like any other region in Vietnam or around Vietnam. It was just like off the charts how much more they were using.
We'll be closing up pretty soon, so we do want to be mindful of everybody's time. But one question that it came up, and on with Zirki, if I mispronounced your name, my apologies. The question of the respiratory mechanisms of, for example, the bats and the arthropods, like how that might impact how their absorptions.
Is this about the bats paper or one of the other examples?
That wasn't quite clarified, but it was just more about the mechanisms behind them.
Yeah, so for bats, what the fungus does is, like I mentioned, it grows on their skin and it is essentially consuming their skin. You can think about that fungus as a parasite on the bats. It not only damages their wings, which is a very severe problem because they rely on flying. The key thing that ends up being lethal is that it agitates them during their winter hibernation. They wake up during the winter and they don't have any food around, and they just end up not surviving until the end of the winter because they were supposed to be hibernating. They need more calories. They have 0 calorie intake basically, and that's the mechanism that leads to like complete collapses of those affected populations.
Actually, one more, Alex. Was WNS an invasive species? Were there control groups that could be measured in other parts of the world where the fungus is native, or was this a new species of fungus?
So not new. The consensus is that it arrived from Europe based on DNA sequencing of the fungus. And the leading hypothesis is that unknowingly hikers brought the spores of the fungus on their backpacks or their boots and unintentionally deposited them in one of those caves in upstate New York. And you could think, so just to make sure, like, yes, the fungus causing white nose syndrome is an invasive species. And you could potentially compare things to places that it's already there, but a key component of what allows for this analysis is that you have places that have not yet been exposed to, but are on the path of exposure and are similar and have populations of bats that can become exposed. And it's kind of like you're following this rolling wave and seeing what happens to these counties as these switches of white nose syndrome turn on relative to the places where they have not yet turned on. And the fact that the data are all from the same reporting system and the same measurement system in the same country just make the comparison a lot easier than having to bring in data from a different country. But like in theory, yes, one could potentially compare to different countries where that with that like collapse of bat populations hasn't happened or happened many, many years ago.
All right. We're going to, if there aren't any other questions, I wanted to mention, I shared a few links in the chat already. Our next application, our upcoming application deadline is October 5th. And I want to mention, for this year, we are waiving the application fee for all master's program applicants. So that is one less hurdle for future change makers such as yourselves to have to deal with. So we wanted to make sure folks knew that. Also noted that you can read more about Professor Frank's research. I sent you a link to his page. And then I also wanted to share, we will have our next masterclass coming up October 22nd with Professor Konstantin Sonin. He'll be speaking about, again, another different topic, example of the breadth of the topics and research covered by our faculty members here at the University of Chicago, Harris Public Policy. He will be, Professor Konstantin Sonin will be speaking about the data culled from the January 6th insurrection here in the United States. Fascinating, both theoretical and empirical information. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, spending time with us wherever you are joining us from, whatever time zone you might be joining us from. And Dr. Frank, thank you so much for taking time for giving an insight into your research work and applications that folks would potentially be able to use and learn while they're at Harris Public Policy. With that, we will close out for the evening. And I do want to remind everybody, if you want to email harrisadmissions@uchicago.edu for the video of this presentation, it's usually available about 48 hours. It depends how quickly it takes Zoom to process. So again, thank you all so much for your time this evening. Again, thank you, Dr. Frank. And we hope to see your application by the 5th. Everybody take care.